Hello, and a warm welcome to Dodger's Trips. I'm Dodger. Today you find me outside the former St Mark's Church in Low Moor, Bradford. The church closed in 2002 and is now private residence split into apartments. On Sunday, 19th of March 1901, the church was packed. Amongst the congregation was Lord Hawke and the Yorkshire cricket team. They had gathered to dedicate a brass memorial plaque, which they themselves had paid for. The plaque read, "To the glory of God and in affectionate remembrance of Lieutenant Frank Milligan, who was killed near Mafeking, March 31st, 1900. St Mark's was the church that this officer and gentleman attended. Frank Milligan was a highly regarded cricketer. He was captain of Low Moor, played for Yorkshire and England. Today we're going to find out more about his life. We'll discover how he became a resident of Low Moor, we'll see where he lived and how he ended up in southern Africa. As St Mark's is no longer a functioning church, we're unable to see the brass memorial plaque. However, we will finish at an accessible and larger memorial here in Low Moor dedicated to Frank Milligan. So join me. Will you? Frank William Milligan was born on the 19th of March 1870 to Captain Charles and Gertrude Milligan. At the time Frank was born, the family were living at Stirling Villas in Alexandra Road, Farnborough in Hampshire. The precise house is not known. However, Stirling Villas is composed of 8 identical properties, so you can get a good idea of the Milligan status. Farnborough is near the garrison town of Aldershot, and Stirling Villas is less than 3 miles from the army camp. Frank was baptised in the camp chapel on the 22nd of May 1870. You can see the month of birth is very difficult to read in the register of baptisms. It has been overwritten and can be read as March or April. After a lot of study, I have leaned towards March. The year of birth is missing from the entry, unlike most of the other infants. By looking at the full page, and indeed the pages either side, it can be seen they are recorded sequentially, and the birth year for those children is 1870. We'll see why I stress this, as later in his life there are instances when his birth year would appear to be 1869. Whilst there is a discrepancy about his birth year on other documents, the date and month is always the 19th of March. Frank's birth was registered in the 3rd quarter of 1870 in the district of Hartley-Wintney in the county of Hampshire. Hartley-Wintney lies 10 miles west of Farnborough. The registration shows his mother's maiden name was Shackley. This is confirmed on the 1861 census. Charles Milligan and Gertrude were at that time residing at Gertrude's mother's home, Buckenhill Mansion in Norton Bromyard in Herefordshire. The building is still standing and is now a hotel. On the census, her mother's occupation is shown as a baronet's widow. Charles is shown as captain in the 39th Regiment, Gertrude as the captain's wife, and the family name is Shackley. Having a child baptised in 1870 ensured they had legal status. Most people did not need identity papers to prove who they were as they went through life, but the Milligans were well connected, and having a legal identity would make it far easier to claim inheritance, for example. So I find it very improbable that they would have had a child in 1869 and then waited 14 months to have it baptised and 18 months to register the birth. It just wouldn't have happened. Charles Milligan was promoted to Major, 39th Dorsetshire Regiment, shortly after Frank was born. Charles would eventually leave the army in 1877 and be given the brevet or honorary rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The year after Frank's birth, the Milligans are living in London at number 8 Clanricarde Gardens, close to Kensington Palace. The census return for 1871 was based on how things were on the 2nd of April that year. In completing the census, the household member's age at last birthday had to be declared. This shows Frank Milligan aged 1. Although I've been unable to obtain a photograph of number 8, most of the houses are of a similar design such as these. Frank Milligan enrolled at Cheam School in the London Borough of Sutton. Cheam is the oldest private school in the country. In the 19th century, the school was strictly for the sons of gentlemen and enrolled boys aged 3 to 13 years. It was well known as a preparatory school for Eton, Harrow and Winchester. In the 1881 census, Frank William Milligan is declared as a pupil and boarder, but aged 10. Why not 11? The census of 1881 was based on actualities on the 3rd of April. This is where entries on some documents begin to sow confusion about Frank's birth year. Frank probably stayed at Cheam until he was 13 years old. I know that he went to Eton aged 13 under the house tutorage of Mr. Coles. The school record shows Frank's age very clearly as 13. This would be correct based on the birth year of 1870, but the year of entry is unclear. It does look more like 1882 than 1883. However, in the Eton Register, a separate document, the years of attendance are 1883 to 1885. The school record shows Frank attended Eton until the 31st of July 1885, but then causes further confusion in giving his age as 16. There is an unsourced report that after leaving Eton he went overseas. I have found nothing to support this. I did find that Frank William Milligan had a service record. Following his death, one newspaper reported that Frank had always wanted a career in the military and that he went through the usual course at Sandhurst, but it was not to be, as the calls of business overrode this desire. I have searched Sandhurst and cannot find Frank Milligan as a cadet, but their records are incomplete. On Frank's service record, his date of birth is given as the 19th of March, same as the baptism record, but the year stated is 1869. The census returns from 1871 and 1891 show Frank's age consistent with a birth year of 1870. It is the census when he was at Cheam, the leaving age at Eton in 1885, and then his service record that throws doubt into the mix. This is the difficulty when going so far back when there are no family descendants to check with and having to deal with sometimes illegible or incorrect transcribing of documents. I shall stick with 1870 for the purposes of this film based on the baptism and birth registration records and the census returns completed by his father. If anybody can categorically prove it different, then I'd love to see your information. Whilst it would be nice not to have these conflicts around a birth year, it is how Frank Milligan lived his life that is the most important thing here. I believe there is a very real possibility Frank attended Heath End, a campus of the Army College at Aldershot. There's a report in the Surrey Advertiser dated the 12th of February 1887 of a F.W. Milligan playing in a football match for Heath End College against nearby Farnham. I have learnt from an obituary that Frank was a keen association footballer and his favourite position was half-back. This is not the same as a half-back in rugby football. In those days, and until the 1970s, in front of the two full-backs would be a centre-half, and either side of that position there would be a right half and left half. In the Surrey Advertiser report, F.W. Milligan's position is that of half-back. The record of service shows that Frank had a knowledge of the German language, and that he had not passed through the Royal Military College, Sandhurst, nor the Staff College at Camberley, but that he did pass the schools of instruction on the 3rd of August 1888. For whatever reason, he didn't join the regular army, but 3 months earlier, on the 16th of May, he had accepted a commission as a second lieutenant in the 4th Battalion, East Surrey, 3rd Regiment. The 4th Battalion were a militia, in other words the equivalent of today's Territorial Army. While Frank had been getting his education, his father inherited Caldwell Hall from his aunt, Lady Sophia Catherine Devoe. This was a very large country mansion and estate near Burton-on-Trent in Derbyshire. One point to note is that within the grounds, Caldwell Hall had a cricket ground. This was the home of Caldwell Cricket Club, for whom Frank would later become president. The Milligan family allowed the club to use the ground for free. Frank's service record shows that he was promoted to lieutenant in the 4th Battalion, East Surrey Regiment on the 28th of January 1891. The census from that year has Frank Milligan listed as a resident at Caldwell Hall. Charles Milligan's occupation is given as a farmer. As well as overseeing the large Caldwell Hall estate, Charles Milligan was also a director of the Low Moor Company in Bradford. Both he and the Devoes, from whom he had inherited the hall, were descendants of Christiana Hurd, the heiress and daughter of Richard Hurd, one of the original partners of the company. The Low Moor Company was a wrought iron foundry, established in 1791 in the village of Low Moor, about 3 miles south of Bradford. The ironworks were built to take advantage of the high-quality iron ore and low-sulphur coal found in the area. The company made raw iron products from 1801 until 1957 for export around the world. At one time, it was the largest ironworks in Yorkshire, controlling a large complex of mines, piles of coal and ore, kilns, blast furnaces, forges and slag heaps, all connected by railway lines. In 1788, the Low Moor Company purchased nearby Royds Hall Manor House and its extensive estate to procure more land for mining. Several senior members of the company would reside at the house through the years right up to 1921. In 1892, Frank Milligan took up a managerial role with the company, probably sent by his father to learn the business and act in his interests. Frank then makes Royds Hall Manor House his home. On the 31st of March 1892, the Ripon Observer carried an advertisement from Frank for a youth to act as a groom and valet to a bachelor in a small house. When I read the small house part, it threw me slightly. Although Royds Hall is a large house in Low Moor, I guess for somebody comfortable with the spaciousness of the 18-bedroomed Caldwell Hall, Royds could be classed as a little on the small side. The house carried a good roster of staff, but maybe Frank wanted to choose his own valet. I'm standing with St Mark's Church behind me. We're going to cross the road and head towards Royds Hall, the house that Frank Milligan would call home for the next 6 years. The street across the road is called Park Bottom. So Park Bottom here used to be longer and joined Huddersfield Road. Midway between St Mark's, which is just through the trees, and the Harrold Club, which you can see there. So about where that person's walking, that's where Park Bottom came round and joined Huddersfield Road. To my right are the original gateposts leading to where St Mark's Vicarage once stood. You can even still see the old stone road here. Now the house was in quite large grounds. If you can imagine a large track going around the house nearest to us, that is where the turning circle for carriages would have been. The vicarage was set further back. There's several properties on this land now, but in the 19th century it was only the vicarage that occupied the space. As we walk towards the end of Park Bottom here, we see another set of gateposts, and these are from the 18th century. The single story, oh, I just spotted a deer, look, a lovely deer. That's great. Yeah, so yeah, this single story property that's attached to the two-storey. The single storey was actually the lodge for Royds Hall Estate, and the entrance here and driveway leads up to the house itself. As we walk up the old track, imagine Frank Milligan travelling this same way all those years ago. Maybe after he'd attended a church service, or been at the ironworks, or just having attended an engagement in Low Moor. So this would have been the most direct route for him into Low Moor. Now there is another road leading from the manor house, actually called Royds Hall Lane, and that leads on to the main Halifax road. So depending which direction he was going, he'd have a choice of tracks. Right, here we are. So this is part of Royds Hall Lane. The left is the boundary wall for Royds Hall Manor House. So we'll walk down a little bit. Although we're not going to be able to see that much of the house from the roadside, it's quite shielded. Here we have a satellite image showing where we started the film in St Mark's Churchyard, following the track across the fields to Royds Hall Manor House itself. And this is a like-for-like comparison between the years 1905 and 2023, showing just how much is still recognisable. We're now going to see two views from about the late 19th century, looking back along the track we've just followed to get to Royds Hall. In the first, you can see numerous wagons using the track, and the wood line that is on their right is still there today. This second view shows Royds Hall Lodge, with the curvature of Park Bottom joining Huddersfield Road near the bowling greens. Harold Club can be seen on the left, with the chimneys of the ironworks rising behind. On the right of the photograph is St Mark's Church. The cottage properties that we're going to see on the right hand side all used to be part of the Royds Hall estate, but through the 20th century, as the hall has been sold on, this part of the estate has been split up into different lots, and so now cottages and the house are under completely different ownership. So what we can see right in front of us here is the old stable block and carriage works. You see a little bit of the manor house there. So I'm not going to go any further down. That's Royds Hall Farm, but yeah, this is the stable block. The gates there into the gardens. What a beautiful big house that is. lived at Royds Hall, Frank Milligan partook of the many social and athletic opportunities afforded to such a well-positioned gentleman of the community. He accepted an invitation to attend the biennial Leeds Bachelors' Ball held on the 24th of January 1893 in the Town Hall. This was an event that the Leeds Mercury newspaper said everybody who's anybody should be there. Frank became chairman of the Low Moor branch of the Primrose League. This was a group dedicated to promoting conservative values. He had previously taken part in Primrose League gatherings when he lived at Caldwell Hall. On the 24th of November 1893, Frank Milligan hosted the Airedale Beagles at Royds Hall. Beagling is traditionally the hunting of hares on foot with a pack of hounds. The group is still in existence, but according to their website, no longer chase hares. The Beagles had close links with Airedale Harriers who were cross-country runners. Maybe a number of participants were members of both groups. Frank was also involved in cross-country running. The first Bradford Harriers Athletics Club folded in 1894, but in 1895 the club was restarted and Frank Milligan was elected the first president. Frank donated a trophy in his name. The F.W. Milligan Cup was awarded to the winner of the club's championship. There was a good number of athletic groups in the city and merging was commonplace. The cup was awarded for many decades, well into the 20th century. There's a report in the Bradford Daily Telegraph of the 18th of December 1915 saying that although the active membership of the Bradford Athletic Club was diminished due to men enlisting in the army, the race for the Milligan Cup would be run that afternoon. The race for the Cup by then was open to novices and new members. The Bradford Observer of the 29th of October 1937 reports the race, the competitors had to complete a 4.5-mile course, was still open to novices. It would be wonderful to know what became of the trophy. I've contacted Bradford Athletics Club asking the question, but not had any reply. If anybody watching this does know the whereabouts of the trophy, I'd love to be able to see it. Possibly due to the demands placed upon him to learn the business of the ironworks, plus the pull of his sporting and social commitments, the London Gazette of the 8th of January 1895 carried a notice that Frank Milligan had resigned his commission in the East Surrey Regiment. Frank would more than once entertain groups who enjoyed viewing the house and grounds. The Brighouse News on the 1st of June 1895 reports that Mr Milligan hosted the Bradford Historical and Antiquarian Society. The group had a formal tour of the house and gardens. The president of the society, Mr T.T. Empsall, then presented a paper about the history of the house and in particular the era that it was occupied by the Rooks family. The Brighouse News then prints the full paper in their report. At the conclusion of his paper, Mr Empsall announced that in addition to Mr Milligan's kindness in permitting them to visit the interesting old hall, he had very kindly provided in an adjoining room a cup of tea and light refreshments for the ladies and a little lunch for the gentlemen. The Reverend Brian Gale moved a vote of thanks to Mr Milligan for his kindness in permitting them to view the old hall and for his generosity in providing the refreshments. This was seconded by Mr Empsall and was warmly accorded. The rooms were then thrown open to the visitors and many of the party availed themselves of the privilege of a leisurely inspection. A remembrance of times gone by at Royds Hall appeared in the Bradford Observer on the 12th of February 1948. It was a gossip column account by an actor who had been appearing in Nell Gwyn at the Theatre Royal on Manningham Lane. He recalled that they would retire to the drawing room of the private house belonging to the well-known cricketer Milligan for bouts of cockfighting until breakfast time. To make sure the police didn't stop them, they always included a few among the invited guests. One other snippet of information I discovered from Frank's time at Royds Hall was that in October 1894 he made a patent application for improvements in the method of and apparatus for adjusting the seats of carriages and other vehicles. I've checked with the British Library, who confirmed that this was a patent application only. It never went to the grant stage and so was never published. Many patent applications in the Victorian era never went to the grant stage. Until the early 20th century, patents were quite exclusive, as it cost several £1,000s to secure a patent, and they were really reserved for the rich or well-connected. The application may have been abandoned or withdrawn, possibly due to financial concerns. The cost may not have been justifiable from a business perspective. The amount of items that needed to be sold to recuperate the cost may not have been possible. It may well have been cheaper and quicker to simply manufacture and sell the item without waiting and paying for the full patent. Or the application could have been refused or deemed void for something simple, such as the paperwork not being completed on time or fees not being paid. Frequent guests at Royds Hall, especially when the Yorkshire cricket team played in Bradford, were Lord Hawke and the Honourable Stanley Jackson. His Lordship was captain and president of Yorkshire, as well as becoming the chairman of the England selectors. He was a great disciple for spreading the game of cricket to as many countries as possible. Jackson would, like Frank Milligan, end up serving in the Second Boer War in 1900. He would succeed Lord Hawke as president of Yorkshire Cricket Club and go on to captain England. Later in his life, he became governor of Bengal. His athletic abilities, gained through many years as a cricketer, stood him in good stead when, at the University of Calcutta, he survived an assassination attempt. A student fired 5 pistol shots at close range, and Jackson ducked and sidestepped each bullet. On one occasion, when the pair were staying with Frank, they were persuaded to take part in a Sunday school concert at Low Moor. The Bradford Observer recalled that the 3 Yorkshire cricketers sang, though not with the same unison and ability that they had displayed at Park Avenue. In 1952, the Yorkshire Observer newspaper remembered that Lieutenant Colonel Milligan had sent his son Frank to live at Royds Hall to learn the business of an ironmaster. What progress young Frank made in the scientific intricacies of puddling, smelting, rolling and drawing, we don't know. But in the joyful skills of batting and bowling, he advanced so rapidly he became the most renowned cricketer in Bradford and Spen Valley club cricket. He was that rare person amid all the glories Yorkshire cricket never produced again. The gay adventurer, the debonair amateur who played with a smile on his face, to whom the fruits of victory were nothing compared to the joy of the contest. The newspaper described Frank as tall, sandy-haired and as straight as a guardsman. They said he became a hero to those who were privileged as youths to see his fast bowling, brilliant fielding and hard hitting. And it is here, on this very field, that Frank's cricketing talents blossomed. Here on his estate, close to his home, was the ground of the Low Moor Cricket Club. I'm so thrilled and excited to be able to walk the very ground where Frank Milligan spent so many hours practicing and playing. I'm so grateful to the present owners of Royds Hall Manor House to allow me to film here today. The Low Moor Cricket Club was formed around 1864 and they were initially known as Royal Blue. The Yorkshire Observer article recalls a time when Low Moor were due to play Bowling Old Lane, whose professional was the famous Shuey Harrison. Frank decided he needed some practice, so a few days preceding the game, he engaged Shuey to bowl to him. Shuey obliged, bowling all day long. Both were satisfied with the day's work, Shuey with his handsome fee and Frank with his excellent practice. Come match day, Shuey shattered Frank's stumps with his very first delivery. Seems it wasn't just Frank learning a thing or two about the opposition during the day spent practising. Shuey had clearly spotted a weakness in Frank's style. A follow-up letter to the newspaper by Mr. Tolson of Dewsbury remembered that Frank, and also his opening batsman partner, Reginald Wickham, who was director of the Low Moor Company, used to have private practice here at Royds Hall. In fact, they were helped by the constant bowling day after day of Willie Carr, a renowned bowler from Liversedge, who was an employee of the ironworks. So I'm now standing in the very centre of what used to be the cricket ground here at Royds Hall. This darkened area used to be a gymkhana area some years ago. There's no longer horses kept at Royds Hall. But yeah, this is right in the centre, probably where the batting pitch was. And just imagine tea being taken in Royds Hall Manor House, food and drinks laid on for the guests and spectators. What a beautiful outlook this cricket ground obviously was back in its day. Probably one of the most picturesque in all of Yorkshire, I should imagine. So where I'm walking now, towards the corner of the fenced area, would have been where the pavilion stood. Now I've got a little story about this that will interest the people of Bradford who are watching. Somewhere in the corner of this field here, just about where the shadow is on the ground, would have stood the pavilion. And a pavilion was first erected here at Royds Hall on the cricket ground in 1888. Now, in the early hours of Friday the 13th of June 1913, a fire was spotted at Royds Hall. A policeman, P.C. Beverley, was on duty in nearby Abscott Lane and noticed a glare in the sky. The fire was also spotted by a workman at Low Moor Works who raised the alarm. P.C. Beverley made his way up to Royds Hall and discovered the pavilion ablaze. The fire brigade from Odsall turned out promptly, but nothing could be done but stand and watch hopelessly. The Bradford Daily Telegraph said that, even if they had arrived earlier, the difficulty of procuring water in so isolated a place would have made it impossible to save the building. In addition to the cost of the pavilion, a large quantity of cricket and tennis accessories were destroyed. Apparently the pavilion was used both by Low Moor Cricket Club and the Royds Hall Lawn Tennis Club, whose lawns adjoined the cricket ground. The newspaper asked the question, is this the work of the suffragettes? But it did go on to say that no direct trace, such as literature, which they would normally leave, had been found. Bradford was experiencing an epidemic of fires. There had been 5 big fires and 4 minor outbreaks in the previous 6 days. Superintendent Forbes of the fire brigade said they had never experienced such an anxious and eventful period. He said firemen are supposed to sleep with one eye open, but nowadays we are having to sleep with both open. We have got beyond the theory that the fires have arisen accidentally. It seems to me that it is the deliberate act of someone, and the person must be wrong in the head. A new pavilion was opened the following year by Reginald Wickham. Thanks were offered to the Low Moor Company for their ongoing support for the cricket club. Wickham recalled with fondness the times he and Frank Milligan used to spend in their shared love for the sport. Mr. Tolson of Dewsbury, in his letter of 1952 to the Observer, bemoans that the beautifully situated ground is no longer used for good-class club cricket. He asked, "Are there no cricketers in the Low Moor district who can revive the glories of the Milligan era?" When did the Low Moor Cricket Club cease to exist? Clearly before Mr. Tolson's letter. Perhaps it was after the assets of the Low Moor Company were sold off and the hall went into private ownership in the late 1920s, early 30s. I've been told by a former pupil that nearby Woodside Middle School used the cricket ground at Royds Hall until the mid-70s. At least the ground was still being used for school cricket until then. So, we've already heard something of Frank Milligan's exuberant and exciting style of playing, but what else do we know about his cricketing career? Frank Milligan was no stranger to the game of cricket when he moved into Royds Hall. He'd played whilst at school and seemingly continued whenever the opportunity arose. I found press cuttings showing that in 1887 he turned out for Lullington in Derbyshire, a village just south of the then Milligan family home at Caldwell Hall. Frank had even made an appearance for Hastings and St Leonard's in July 1889. This match was possibly a result of an invitation to play whilst visiting somebody who was involved with the club. With the cricket pitch in the grounds at Royds Hall, he started playing for Low Moor during the 1892 season. In the Leeds Mercury of the 17th of April 1893, the club announces that they will again have the services of Frank Milligan. They recall he rendered such valuable service to the team the previous year, and that no doubt the 11 will occasionally be strengthened by gentlemen who are visiting Mr Milligan. Frank was apparently a pretty good all-rounder, useful as a change fast bowler, hard-hitting batsman and excellent fielder. His performances for Low Moor were soon grabbing the attention of the county. In 1894 he was offered a trial for Yorkshire and played in a first-class match against Derbyshire. Unfortunately, the trial was not a success. He only scored 4 runs in each of his innings and his bowling was not that economical. Frank would only play once more for Yorkshire that year. Continuing to put in strong performances for Low Moor Cricket Club, he was invited to trial again for Yorkshire in 1895, this time with some success. So much so, in fact, that he became a regular for Yorkshire until 1898. He was even the standing captain on more than one occasion. At the beginning of the 1895 season, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph said of Frank, "He is a well-known West Riding amateur, enthusiastic, who bowls fast but erratically, and who hits hard but rashly." The paper goes on to say he is young and he is expected to improve in both departments of the game. By the end of the 95 season, Frank headed the Yorkshire bowling averages. He tended to be used in the lower middle order of the batting line-up. Although he never made a century for the county, the Keighley News said he had provided good service in many a stiff contest. On the 26th of August 1895, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph reported that Frank Milligan was part of Frank Mitchell's team of English cricketers under the name Cambridge-Oxford, who had accepted an invitation from the Association of Philadelphia to play a series of matches throughout September in North America. Frank had never been to Cambridge or Oxford universities, but a minority of the touring party were selected from county sides, hence Frank's inclusion. The first match was in New York on the 4th of September. The tourists then travelled to Toronto to play All Canada. The English cricketers then went to see Niagara Falls before a match in Philadelphia. The tour concluded on the 30th of September. A North American cricket tour was not as unusual as it might be today. American sides became frequent tourists during this era. From 1896 to 1898, Frank Milligan took part in matches whenever his business engagements allowed. In those days, county cricketers were a mix of amateurs and professionals. The Keighley News gave the opinion that Frank was an amateur of the best type, always displaying the best spirit of sportsmanship. As well as his club and county, Frank also represented on occasion Bradford, the MCC, the North in matches versus the South. He played for the Yorkshire Gentlemen v the Yorkshire Players, also the National Gentleman team versus the Players. The Gentlemen v Players matches were frequent fixtures right up until 1961. They were contests between a team consisting of amateurs, the gentlemen, and a team consisting of professionals, the players, that reflected the English class structure of the 19th century. Typically, the professionals were working class people who earned their living by playing cricket, while the amateurs were middle and upper class products of the public school system who were supposedly unpaid for playing. The professionals were paid wages by their county clubs and sometimes fees by match organisers, while the amateurs claimed expenses. However, while rules to distinguish amateurs from professionals were established by the MCC, the system of allowable expenses was both controversial and complex, enabling some leading amateurs to be paid more than any professional for playing cricket. From the many press reports during the 1890s, Frank Milligan was very much an exponent of the present-day baseball approach, a swashbuckling player who very often scored his runs at a fast pace. For example, he was 134 not out for the MCC and scored that total in only 100 minutes. Another time he knocked up 65 in 74 minutes. With his reputation as a dynamic batsman, he would be expected to entertain the crowds whenever he took to the crease. He recounts how clubs would pay him handsomely for his attendance at their fixture, as he was guaranteed to pull in the crowds. The Gloucester Echo in 1900 reminisced, describing Frank as a dashing bat and a big hitter. They said Birmingham people will remember him hitting a ball over the pavilion at Edgbaston. Frank was credited with one of the mightiest hits in all cricket history. Low Moor were playing Spen Victoria in the 1896 Heavy Woolen Cup final at the Dewsbury and Savile ground. The Heavy Woolen Cup began in 1883 and is the oldest club cricket competition in the country, if not the world. Frank is reported to have driven a ball from Ben Hurst, a famous bowler of the 1890s, straight out of the ground, over a street, and pitched it at the feet of the local policeman patrolling his beat. The distance given was 130 yards. This is surely accurate, as it was stridden out by the policeman on his wrathful way to castigate this public danger. Mr. Tolson, our letter writer from Dewsbury, who we have previously heard from, remembered the shot but wrote, "Alas for human glory. Milligan was clean bowled next ball for a score of 29. Low Moor lost the final." The Yorkshire Observer noted Frank Milligan was such an attraction, clubs would write to him weeks in advance to ensure he was playing so that they could pay him. These were the days when clubs appointed their own umpire, and they were often the 12th man with their biased decision-making. Milligan was the great danger, and after having persuaded him to play, the next thing was getting him out. Frank was rarely heard to complain, but this was the one thing in club cricket that annoyed him. Throwing his bat into the corner of the dressing tent one Saturday afternoon, after a particularly disgusting decision, he exclaimed, "These teams pester me for weeks to play against them, and then they give me out LBW when I've knocked the ball clean out of the field." Frank was a member of the Yorkshire side that made an astonishing 887 runs against Warwickshire at Edgbaston in the 1896 season. This was a record-breaking score, one that still stands today. Frank only contributed 34 to that total, but contributed to history-making all the same. Despite the massive score, the match ended in a draw. Lord Hawke, who we have already learnt was a frequent visitor to Royds Hall, was the captain of Yorkshire from 1883 until 1910. He was also elected Yorkshire Club President in 1898, a position he held until his death in 1938. In addition, he was chairman of the England selection panel from 1899 for 10 years. As well as cricket, Lord Hawke and Frank shared an enjoyment of both cycling and photography. Whenever the weather allowed, they would both cycle to Yorkshire's matches. In the Lloyd's Weekly News of the 12th of May 1907, there's an account of a presentation ceremony for a testimonial, and they observe that during the speeches, Lord Hawke was perilously perched on a precarious footing, snapshotting the scene. The paper recalled that Frank Milligan was also an indefatigable snapshotter, and thanks to his unique chances, possessed a remarkable collection taken of famous cricketers, not always when they were playing cricket either. Whatever became of these mementos of times past? Yorkshire Cricket Archives are held at the West Riding Archives at Morley. I submitted an online search, but there were no results for Frank Milligan, let alone his photographs. Maybe his collection passed to his family upon his death. His father, Lieutenant Colonel Milligan, was an early photographer. His sister Blanche was also an enthusiastic photographer, even having some of her work exhibited at the Kodak Museum in London. So it wouldn't be surprising if Frank's pictures ended up at Caldwell Hall. When the Milligan family line ended in 1960, the hall and all its contents were auctioned. A local man, De Broy Sutton, who was a keen photographer himself, attended the sale hoping to buy Blanche's camera, but this turned out to be included with other items and put it out of his reach. Following the sale, workmen were clearing out the junk, items that hadn't been offered for sale. The foreman saw De Broy looking at some old photographic plates and he said, "Take them if you want." This is why we now have the photograph of Frank Milligan in the uniform of the East Surrey Regiment, along with the family group picture where Frank is seated and wearing the boater. Maybe Frank's photographs were simply binned as junk. The Derbyshire Record Office have a collection of photographs by Miss Milligan, but they're not individually catalogued. This means without paying a lot of money to get copies of everything, I've been unable to retrieve any other photographs there might be of Frank from Blanche's work. I discovered that Frank Milligan left England on the 2nd of January 1897 aboard the RMS Norman, bound for the Cape. Why he went and for how long I don't know. I'm into the realms of conjecture. I know he was still living at Royds Hall and therefore still an employee of the Low Moor Company. On the passenger list, his age is given as 27, when he wouldn't have turned 27 until the 19th of March. Maybe this was because he wouldn't be returning until after that date. On the list he uses his father's occupation of farmer. An obituary mentions an interest in mining opportunities when he went to the Cape in 1898. Was this trip, a year earlier, a reconnaissance operation on behalf of the Low Moor Company? Mining was certainly part of their portfolio. Or was this Frank starting to tire of the ironworks and looking to open business interests for himself? No doubt, in the Cape he would have moved in well-connected social circles that would have offered up good contacts. I know that Frank was back in England by May, as he took part in Yorkshire's match against Gloucestershire commencing the 13th of that month. The Manchester Courier of the 11th of April 1900 suggested that 1897 was perhaps Frank's best season for Yorkshire. In the 1898 season, Yorkshire romped to the top of the county championship and were never seriously threatened. Frank played in 23 of the 26 matches that year. The last match of the season commenced on the 22nd of August against Sussex at Hove. This would result in another victory for the champions. With the championship secured, the Bridlington Free Press profiled the Yorkshire players. They said Frank had refined his skills greatly during the season, no doubt helped by a consistent run of appearances. The paper said he still required a little studying, but his defence had shown a marked improvement and he played the forcing game perfectly. Frank had played several good innings. They thought his best performance had been at Sheffield when things were looking decidedly bleak for Yorkshire. The paper added, "He can be relied on to get wickets when the other bowlers are struggling, and Frank's fielding is brilliant." They conclude that with a little application of Tunnicliffe's methods to his batting, Frank will develop into a useful member. Following the end of the regular championship season, the Yorkshire side travelled overnight from Brighton to reach Scarborough for the opening day's play of the annual cricket festival. Yorkshire were playing the MCC in the first match. Frank also turned out for the gentlemen in their match against the Players. He finished the game with the excellent bowling figures of 7 for 61. The third and final match of the festival saw Frank and Yorkshire in action again, this time against Mr. Thornton's 11. Although he didn't know it, this would turn out to be Frank's last game for Yorkshire, and indeed his very last match on an English ground. He was clearly a player with lots of unfulfilled potential. Where previously he'd only played when his business commitments allowed, maybe now the pendulum was swinging more towards his sporting life. I think it extremely probable that at this moment Frank was given an ultimatum by his employers, the Low Moor Company: choose business or cricket. Was he spending so much time in practice, in playing and in travelling to matches that his focus was not on company business anymore? After the close of the 1898 season, Lord Hawke was planning to take an England 11 overseas. Hawke had originally wanted to take a side to the West Indies, but the economy there and the devastation that a recent hurricane had caused scuppered that idea. So a very much last-minute tour of South Africa was arranged. Aside from himself, Hawke chose 4 fellow Yorkshire cricketers for the tour. The playing roster was made up of only 12 men. Yes, only 12 players for what was to be a hectic tour. From the champions, Hawke selected Frank Mitchell, Schofield Haig, C.E.M. Wilson and Frank Milligan. Frank went out to the Cape 2 weeks before the rest of the England side. He departed Southampton on the 19th of November 1898 aboard RMS Britain. The touring party proper left England on the 3rd of December, travelling aboard RMS Scott, arriving at Cape Town on the 20th. An unsourced remark in a mini-profile of Frank Milligan that I found stated that he went to the Cape after several of his ideas were not taken up by the Low Moor Company. Were his proposals the result of the previously unknown trip to the Cape in early '97? Whatever the reason, the 1898 tour had come about, he'd been selected and off he went, evidently choosing cricket over business, at least for the time being. By leaving 2 weeks earlier than the rest of the playing group makes me suspect that he had left the company, had nothing to gain staying in Bradford, and headed to southern Africa to renew acquaintances before the cricket tour began. Only days after Frank left England, his friend and Low Moor Company director, Reginald Wickham, was installed as the new tenant at Royds Hall. The tour was comprised of 24 fixtures. At the time, the side believed they had played 4 test matches against South Africa, but in retrospect, only 2 of those matches retained their test status. A further 3 games were deemed first class. Frank played in both test matches and the 3 first-class games. In fact, he only missed 3 games of the entire tour. With the playing staff being so minimal, there were occasions when replacements had to be called up. An unofficial recruit was the Honourable Eustace Fiennes, who was secretary to Frank Rhodes, brother of Cecil, and a great friend of Lord Hawke. Fiennes played in 2 matches. His grandson Ranulph would lead the Trans-Globe expedition some 80 years later. The tour was a success and England won both test matches. The South Africa team were much improved since Hawke's last tour there in 1896. The first test match started on the 14th of February 1899 at Johannesburg. This resulted in England winning a close game by the margin of only 32 runs. Schofield Haig, one of the Yorkshire contingent, reported that although there was grass on a couple of the pitches, all games were played on a matted wicket. The mat was allowed to loosen throughout each fixture. This was very helpful for the bowlers, but on the other hand, it made batting a very difficult proposition. Lord Hawke found it particularly tough going, and he would relegate himself to the bottom of the batting lineup. This would be Lord Hawke's last overseas tour. Frank Milligan would put in some good bowling performances. This one here against the Johannesburg 15 saw him take 10 wickets for 64 runs. The promoter was James Douglas Logan, known as one of the founding fathers of South African cricket. He guaranteed to cover all expenses. Any resulting profits were to go to the South African Cricket Association. The tour had plenty of fringe benefits. The Sporting Life reported Lord Hawke's side were being shown overwhelming hospitality, with an abundance of visits to the theatre and dinner invitations, and no end of people wanting to welcome them into their homes. There was a lot of travelling involved between matches. For example, following the fixture at Kimberley, the touring party had a 55-hour train journey to Bulawayo in Rhodesia. Neither was the travelling without incident. On one occasion, the train taking the team to Matjiesfontein was in collision with a goods train. 2 England players were slightly injured. One of them was Frank Milligan, though it didn't stop him playing in the match. Lord Hawke's 11 were often pitted against teams with anything up to 22 players, as was the case in the Matjiesfontein match. An unlikely recruit who turned out for the England 11 in their match against Matjiesfontein was Henry Lund. Now Henry Lund, believe it or not, was Frank Milligan's servant. I've been unable to find anything else about Lund except that in the 1901 census returns for Royds Hall he is listed as being 28 years of age, single, British born, with the occupation butler domestic for the Wickham family. Was he the groom valet that Frank Milligan advertised for when he first moved into Royds Hall? Lund would have been 19 years old at that time. What a tale he had to tell in later life, playing for an England cricket 11 on tour in South Africa. The second Test match began on the 1st of April in Cape Town, and this resulted in a comfortable victory for the tourists, England winning by 210 runs. The second Test match was the final game of the tour. The England players left the Cape on the 5th of April 1899, with one exception: Frank Milligan. When the party arrived back in England, they were able to report a very enjoyable trip. They had seen the mines at Kimberley and Johannesburg. They had especially enjoyed their time in Bulawayo. Many of the party had brought back souvenirs. Schofield Haig had returned with many warlike items, including guns, shields and assegais. Haig was very modest about his own efforts with the ball. He had topped the bowling averages, but praised Frank Milligan's bowling, saying his 48 wickets were achieved at the low rate of 12 runs each. So, Bulawayo had left a favourable impression on the England side, and this is where Frank Milligan was heading next. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the film, we're now heading to a well-known memorial to Frank Milligan, and it's here in Harold Park, Low Moor. Now as we walk to the park, I just want you to remember the backs of those terrace properties over there, and there's a reason for that that'll be revealed in a few minutes' time. There's also a row of 3 terraced houses. Now the street behind and this row of terraces were all there in the era that we're talking about here in this film, around 1900. So this is the Cemetery Road entrance to Harold Park, and I want you to notice the 2 gateposts there and then compare it with the photograph here. Very probably a pre-First World War photograph, definitely taken after the year 1901. And if you just look over the person on the right hand side with the white shirt, Just look over his left shoulder, you can see a monument there. Can you see that? With some steps leading up to it. Well, we're going to find the location of that now. In the photograph there's obviously 3 gate posts where now there's only 2. This was where the original gate post was, and the lock-in section here for the double gates. The park was planted a bit more generously back in the Victorian Edwardian era. There were a lot more bushes and shrubs, what have you. But on the map you can see that this section here was like a screen. So when you came into the park, it was a little bit of a surprise. You came around that screen of trees and bushes and you came into this area. When my kids were smaller, about 20, 30 years ago, we used to come to Harold Park quite regularly. And there was always, in this location, a stepped base. And I often wondered what it was, but as the kids come through the entrance of the park, they would make for these 2 or 3 steps up to like nothing, just a flat platform, and then jump off and carry on. But I always wondered what that was for. It was obviously something had been mounted on it in the past. And we can see from the photos that this is the original location of the Milligan Memorial. So if we compare it with one of the photographs, the memorial was immediately in front of us here on the hexagonal 3-stepped base, and beyond was the ornamental pond, which in later years became a paddling pool for kids. So we'll just wander over and see a view from the other direction. This drain cover, I would suggest, is probably from around the centre of the ornamental pond, probably where the water was, where the pond was filled or drained. So looking at one of the other photographs there from the opposite direction, in front was the ornamental pond, and beyond it, where I've just been stood, just in front of the cycle racks, was the location of the Milligan Memorial. And you can see immediately behind the 3 terrace properties there, and further to the left, although you can't really see it through the trees, you can see the back of the street of terrace properties as well.
On the 27th of May 1902, Yorkshire Cricket Club, the county champions, wrapped up another victory after playing Kent at Park Avenue in Bradford. Following the close of play, both sets of players made their way to this very area of Harold Park. They were joined here by the Lord Mayor of Bradford, William C. Lupton, members of the council, Reginald Wickham of the Low Moor Company, and many local people. They had all come together to attend the unveiling of the Milligan Memorial. We heard at the beginning of the film that Lieutenant Frank Milligan was killed in action in southern Africa on the 31st of March 1900. There were differing reports coming out of South Africa, but within weeks of his death being confirmed, there were calls for some kind of memorial to Frank. From the many testimonials that the newspapers carried, there was clearly a substantial amount of affection for Frank Milligan. An initial meeting on the 29th of May 1900 at Hilltop Infant School in Low Moor to discuss the idea of providing a memorial saw officers elected and a commitment to meet again the following month. On the 19th of June, the Yorkshire Cricket Club Committee stated that whilst they supported a memorial, they were conscious 2 other Yorkshire cricketers were, at the time, involved in the South African War. The club felt it prudent to await the end of hostilities before committing themselves to a memorial to just one person. This thought changed very quickly, as just 3 weeks later the Yorkshire Club Committee agreed to organise a memorial and donated 100 guineas to head up the donor list. At the end of August, a donor list was printed in the Yorkshire Post. As well as the 100 guineas from the Yorkshire Club, The Low Moor Company had donated £100. The fund closed at the end of November. The fund, organised by Yorkshire, had raised £455. The locally raised fund in Low Moor agreed to make this up to £600 so 3 cots could be donated to the Bradford Children's Hospital. They would be known as the Frank Milligan cots and would each have his name upon them. Lord Hawke was to arrange that a photograph of Frank Milligan would be near to each cot, and wherever possible the children of cricketers would use them. Reginald Wickham presided over the unveiling ceremony. The Lord Mayor formally acknowledged the handing over of the memorial from the city. Lord Hawke, in addressing the crowd, thought no other serviceman from the war had been honoured 3 times in such a way as the brass plaque in St Mark's, the cots for the Children's Hospital and the ornamental sundial here in Harold Park. His Lordship said to the listening youngsters that if they wished to succeed in life, they should follow Frank Milligan's example. He said Frank was one of the kindest and best, and that he was the most unselfish man he had ever known. I wanted to show you where the Milligan Memorial sundial was originally placed before we go on to see the memorial itself. It's had quite a checkered history in its own right, and I will be covering something of that in a little while. So, as I make my way to the present day location of the memorial, let's head back to where we left Frank Milligan, on his way to Bulawayo in Rhodesia. We'll learn what the circumstances were that contributed to his death, a little less than a year after the England 11's tour of Southern Africa had come to a close. Southern Africa in 1899 was a hotbed of tension and arm wrestling between the various republics and empires who control that part of the continent. British South Africa had borders with German Southwest Africa and Portuguese East Africa. In between was the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, which were together known as the Boer republics after the people of Dutch origin who had settled there. Cecil Rhodes, the Prime Minister of the Cape, had a vision of a British-controlled Africa stretching from Cape Town right up to Cairo. In 1867, a diamond had been discovered near the Orange River. Later, larger discoveries were made near Kimberley. Several small gold rushes had predated what became the largest ever gold rush at Witwatersrand Basin in the Transvaal during the mid-1880s. This resulted in an overwhelming number of white immigrants flocking to the area. Ownership of the mines quickly fell into the hands of a few entrepreneurs, mainly white Europeans. Paul Kruger, who was the president of the Transvaal, was becoming increasingly alarmed at the number of foreigners. He felt there was an imminent danger of the British Empire expanding its influence, and so voting restrictions and heavy taxes attempted to stem this. The Boer republics were very concerned about retaining their independence. The British in the Cape, still with its thoughts on imperial expansion, were concerned that it was no longer the predominant economic power in southern Africa. This was the land Frank Milligan was traversing on his way to Rhodesia. Colonial settlers had made Bulawayo a boomtown. It was still very much a frontier town when Frank was there. It didn't have its own municipal council with elected members until November 1897, and the arrival of the railroad in that same year had made Bulawayo the country's major centre for mining, ranching and industrial activity. The area was rich in mineral wealth, from gold to base metals. Whether Frank gained employment in Bulawayo is unknown. A piece in the Athletic News of the 23rd of October 1899 stated that he had gone to Bulawayo for the mining opportunities. Another newspaper makes mention that he planned a hunting trip through Rhodesia. My guess is he probably did plan to do some hunting and have some leisure time before seeking employment. He was quite familiar with shoots, as these were held frequently at Caldwell Hall. Apparently Frank was a very good shot. No doubt he would have socialised at the club in Bulawayo. This was the club for gentlemen in the town. Back in England, a bankruptcy notice against Frank Milligan appeared in the London Gazette of the 27th of June 1899. It was informing Frank Milligan, late of Royds Hall, and whose present residence the judgment creditor had been unable to ascertain. The High Court ordered that the publication of the notice was deemed to be a service of the bankruptcy notice upon him. The notice was brought by Jonas Wolfe of 4 Oxford Place in Leeds. The amount owed is not detailed. What is known is that Jonas Wolfe was a moneylender. At that time, Parliament was scrutinising the workings of such businesses, their interest rates and particularly their practice of operating under different aliases. Jonas Wolfe was one of the lenders who had been named before the Parliamentary Committee because he also operated from Piccadilly in London under a different name. Did Frank borrow money for his venture into African mining? I think it must be considered highly likely. His father, Lieutenant Colonel Milligan, was hardly poor. In fact, when he died in 1902, he left an estate valued in excess of £100,000, which is almost £16 million in today's money. I think Frank was an independent type, trying to make his way, by and large, through his own efforts, whether that be sporting, looking to register a patent, or striking out on his own in Africa to pursue his goals through his own means. Southern Africa was heading almost inevitably towards war between the British Empire and the Boer republics. The British government didn't want to appear as though this was unavoidable, so they couldn't openly send out reinforcements to the small army that it held in the colonies. What the Ministry for War did do was to order Colonel Baden-Powell, later to be founder of the Scout movement, out to the Cape to covertly raise, train and equip 2 regiments of mounted troops. The press was told they were there in case of a native uprising. In actual fact, they were a Rhodesia frontier force to be a deterrent to any thoughts the Boers may have had about invading the country when war broke out. Colonel Baden-Powell arrived in Bulawayo in early August 1899. Horses, arms and equipment all had to be brought in covertly, as the British government didn't want to be accused of inflammatory behaviour. Baden-Powell was to be assisted by about 20 special service officers. They were hand-picked from various British Army regiments. Captain Kenneth McLaren of the 13th Hussars described how he travelled with 7 other special service officers from Cape Town to Bulawayo by train, a 6-day journey covering over 1,600 miles. Of the 2 regiments, Baden-Powell would take command of one and take them south to the town of Mafeking. The other regiment, Frank's, was under the command of Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Plummer. Frank Milligan, in a letter dated the 30th of September 1899 to Reginald Wickham, an extract of which appeared in the Bradford Daily Telegraph, mentions Baden-Powell raising 3 regiments, but most sources do state that his orders were to enrol just the 2. In the letter, Frank says their regiment has been formed some 6 weeks and they had moved to the current location for field practice before a planned move 150 miles towards the front. War was not yet declared, but you can see that the regiment was pushing ahead to be ready on the assumption that it was close, or as Frank writes, when the umpires called play. Frank mentioned that a racket club had been formed at Bulawayo and he was just getting good at the game when it had been time to move. Frank Milligan proudly writes how he was the only person to gain a commission in the Rhodesia Regiment. He was given the rank of lieutenant and was second in command of the 55-man strong C Squadron. I think when the opportunity arose to enlist, he would have done so pretty sharply. From his training at Heath End Army College and his service with the militia, he'd been drawn towards the military. His father had served in the Crimean War. His brother George, who was 7 years the elder, had only recently retired as a captain in the Coldstream Guards. George had served during the Sudan campaign in the 1880s. Frank probably thought everything had fallen into place so he could now have a crack at active service himself. He continues in his letter to Wickham saying the job may be over in 3 weeks or 3 months, but that if the Orange Free State join with the Transvaal, there's no knowing how long it will last. He said that business is at a standstill in Bulawayo and he is glad to be out of it until things liven up again. In a strange link to Bradford, he says that he won a race the other day on a pony called Low Moor in a match against one of Cecil Rhodes's ponies. He describes the duty in camp at Unizingwani as hard. He says Rivali is at 5:15 a.m. and the officers are expected to be up before then to kick the men up. They are generally in bed between 8:30 and 9 p.m, so they get plenty of sleep, except that night he was on night duty, so it meant an all-night sitting. Captain McLaren had said that they got a lot of their recruits from people who had come out from England in the hunt for gold and not found any. The Rhodesia Regiment was going to be patrolling, guarding, harassing and flustering the enemy. Apart from defending the border regions, they would tie up enemy troops and keep them away from the coast so British troops would be able to land unopposed. The Rhodesia Regiment was to be a short-term venture, with a 6-month enlistment extended to 9 should war break out. In the end, the regiment was disbanded in September 1900. Colonel Baden-Powell would initiate the siege in Mafeking, by which he would become a household name. He deliberately did this to constrain the Boers in large numbers. The Boers were aware of a certain build-up of troops close to their countries and sent the British an ultimatum to desist. When they didn't, the Boers crossed their borders and attacked, indeed, as they believed, before they themselves were attacked by the British. The Second Boer War began on the 11th of October 1899. Sea Squadron were in a fortified position on the Transvaal border across the Limpopo River near Fort Tully when war was declared. As expected, there was plenty of movement over the coming weeks and months as they ran into skirmishes and kept the enemy guessing where they were and how strong. The Rhodesia Regiment were often bettered in these fights, but the Boers never pressed home their advantage when in a position to do so. Their watchwords were, "Where's Plummer?" They were always afraid of overextending themselves or being lulled into an ambush. Sea Squadron were also sent to reinforce the garrison at Fort McCluskey for a time. By aggressive patrolling, Plummer had been able to disguise the weakness of his forces. Frank posted a letter to the secretary of Yorkshire Cricket Club on the 13th of November 1899, whilst he was based at McCluskey. A summary of the letter appeared in the Herald in January. He mentions being out on patrol from 6 a.m. on a Sunday until the following Thursday. Frank said it was hard riding as the camps were often 30 miles apart. With no roads, they navigated by compass and covered 189 miles. Frank advised the secretary that he intends to be in Sheffield in May for the new cricket season if all goes well. Frank's return from Southern Africa was also mentioned in the Athletic News. The paper said there is a hope that he will be back by midsummer and that he will prove to be bulletproof while he is there. As we heard in Frank's letter, the work was very gruelling as this was tough country to cross. Captain Jarvis from D Squadron wrote to his mother that it's the same game, hunting and stalking each other. We march out at 2:30 a.m. and return at 8 p.m. We have tea and bully beef and tea, breakfast, lunch and dinner. He goes on to say, "You've never seen so many beetles, scorpions, creepy things generally that are about the place. Men are worried about bathing in the water because of crocodiles." By December 1899, the threat of a Boer invasion into Rhodesia had dissipated, and leaving a small force of about 150 to 200 men at Fort Tully, Plummer marched his column 200 miles south. By January, they were at Gaborone. Plummer intended to lure any Boer forces away from Rhodesia and also Mafeking the town still under siege, and if possible effect a relief. I hope that overview of the situation in southern Africa and the type of country the soldiers were confronted with was helpful in understanding the circumstances that led to Frank going to war and the conditions he faced. The camp at Gaborone is where I believe the last photograph of Frank Milligan was taken. I found this small picture in an old and very faded scrapbook that Captain McLaren and his family made. The writing underneath says Milligan, Gaborone. And you can see it's a photograph of Frank outside his bivouac in camp. We shall now see how the final day of Frank Milligan's life unfolded. It is the 31st of March, 1900. From reporting that he had 988 men in February 1900, the strength of Plummer's column evaporated as he left men behind as cover at various locations during the journey south and westwards. Frank, along with C Squadron, was still with Plummer's main column. Plummer's scouts found that there was no Boers at the small village named Ramatlabama. He left a small detachment of 30 dismounted men there and moved south. Colonel Plummer's column, now down to about 270 men, got within 4 miles of Mafeking. The Boer forces, of which there were estimated to be about 2,000 laying siege to the town, soon began to turn their attention to Plummer. After making contact, the Rhodesia Regiment had some initial success. However, after fighting on a 2-mile wide front, the superior numbers of the enemy forced them to fight their way back to Ramatlabama, with the continual threat of being flanked. What Plummer's scouts hadn't realised earlier in the day was that there was a Boer camp in the vicinity, and they had reoccupied this. There was then a standing fight for a time at where the only cover was a 2-foot-high railway embankment. Again, the Boers tried flanking his force. Plummer had no choice but to continue a slow fighting withdrawal in good order at walking pace. The mounted squadrons falling back in succession, covering the dismounted men as they slowly fought their way back to Sefitili, about 30 miles northwest of Mafeking. It was during this fighting withdrawal that Frank Milligan was mortally wounded. There was much confusion in the days and weeks that followed regarding Frank's fate. There's an account that Frank was hit in the calf near to Mafeking, but managed to ride back to Ramatlabama unaided before being hit again, and he was unable to be helped as he could not then move. The most numerous versions say that he was hit with volley fire during the fight at Ramatlabama while his squadron was in position covering the withdrawal of the dismounted men. His skipper, Captain McLaren, was himself hit a few minutes later. Captain McLaren would at first be reported killed until it was ascertained he was wounded and a prisoner of the Boers. A 9-page handwritten document written by Captain McLaren recalling the actions of the Plummer column was found at a flea market and put up for auction in 2015. McLaren describes the action that led to the moment Frank was killed. He said, "We advanced on Mafeking hoping to draw the Boers away from there and give Colonel Robert Baden-Powell a holiday. They were too strong and gave us a very warm time. We only had about 200 mounted men and they killed or wounded 40 of us. I was very sorry to have my subaltern killed by my side. Besides being a great friend, he had shown himself to be a most reliable officer and full of pluck and judgment. I was able to give him no assistance as 10 minutes afterwards I was severely wounded in 3 places and left on the veldt from 5 p.m. one day till 11 a.m. the next. The Boers came along and took me and 2 other prisoners 16 miles over rough veldt to the hospital." A letter from a correspondent at Plummer's base camp describes the circumstances of Frank's death and Captain McLaren's wounds. Captain McLaren got hit in the thigh and Mr. Milligan in the calf. 4 or 5 horses went down, so most of us wanted to help those who had lost their nags. All this time the bullets were coming like hail. Captain McLaren was hit again in the stomach, and Mr. Milligan rolled out of his saddle. We all pulled up again, but we could do absolutely nothing, as Mr. Milligan could not move, and to all appearances Captain McLaren was dead. 2 men supported him in his saddle for 3 or 4 miles until he was hit the second time. Captain McLaren rode for miles with a shattered thigh. First reports back in England give Frank as killed. The Times correspondent reported from Bulawayo on the 3rd of April that Captain McLaren was severely wounded and Lieutenant Milligan fatally wounded while holding with the utmost tenacity the position which had been assigned to them. As the days passed, suggestions appeared saying Frank was wounded but a prisoner, until those hopes were extinguished and there really was no doubt that he had been killed. What an awful time this must have been for his family. Eventually they accepted his death and posted an obituary advertisement in the Times. 2 officers and 6 men were killed in the fight. 3 officers and 36 men were wounded, and 1 officer and 11 men were taken prisoner. The other officer to be killed was Captain Crew, who was head of Plymouth Scouts. I presume that he died of his wounds rather than being killed outright, as the next day his body and that of 2 troopers were repatriated. Crew was buried in Mafeking Cemetery. When the repatriation party arrived, they discovered only the 3 bodies. They found that their pockets had been rifled while the boots of 1 had been removed. They said the action of removing boots from the dead savours of the barbaric, but then pointed out that the Boers and some of their own men were almost soulless. They assumed that Lieutenant Milligan had been buried by the Boers. During the last week in April, Father Andrew Hartman, the Roman Catholic chaplain who had been with Plummer's column, and the Anglican Archdeacon James Upcher went to Ramat Labama, and a group of Boers took them to the spot where Frank Milligan had been buried. Frank had only received a cursory burial in a shallow where an aardvark had been burrowing. Father Hartman doesn't disclose whether Frank's property was also rifled, but both he and Archdeacon Upcher identified Frank and marked his grave with a wooden cross. I discovered that Archdeacon Upcher was or had been a keen cricketer. A copy of a report that had appeared in the Rhodesia Herald was carried in an 1893 issue of Cricket Weekly. It shows Archdeacon Upcher appearing in 2 matches in Salisbury, the capital of Rhodesia, one for an all-comers side against the civil service, and then also for the home-born side against a colonial-born side. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that the Archdeacon saw Frank play for Lord Hawke's England 11 in their game at Bulawayo in 1899. The visit of the England side would have been a big attraction at the time in Rhodesia, and now here he was, a year later, being responsible for giving Frank a Christian committal. So Frank Milligan was left at the place he died. Father Hartman stated Frank was buried near cottage 174 at the 880 mile peg. Following the ending of the Boer War, the Guild of Loyal Women dedicated themselves to marking and registering the graves of the fallen from both sides. They would erect metal crosses known as Gregory crosses after the foundry that made them, and where possible a brass inscription plate would be attached. The British were not that meticulous in keeping records, and so the graves of the fallen, particularly such as Frank's, in an isolated place that was in effect behind enemy lines, were never registered. The Guild of Loyal Women were quite the opposite and very disciplined with their record keeping. They attended large cemeteries and also out-of-the-way locations where maybe a single grave was known. Of course, only the 2 priests really would have known where Frank was buried. They had done their job at the time by erecting a cross. They wouldn't have memorised the location. Frank, as we have already heard, was buried in a shallow dip where an aardvark had been burrowing. This would mean there was a body of ants nearby, and certainly the South African veldt generally had them in abundance. The cross over the years would have been eaten by ants, destroyed by wildfire or simply rotted away and the grave location lost forever. I've searched the records of the Guild of Loyal Women and every other website I could find relating to Boer War burials and checked dozens of cemeteries just in case Frank was reburied in a formal graveyard, but to no avail. I have attempted to contact people in Ramat, Alabama, which even today is only a small place. There's a smattering of houses, the railway still runs nearby, and the land is flat and open, but again no success in finding the gravesite. Ramat, Alabama is a border crossing in present-day Botswana with South Africa's northern boundary. In May 1900, Colonel Milligan expressed gratitude for the sympathy he had received following Frank's death. He said that Frank was offered the chance to be invalided to Durban, but chose to stick it out and complete his service. Colonel Milligan said they had received a letter dated just 4 days before he was killed, in which Frank noted Providence had watched over him so far, and he hoped to be in Mafeking in a few days. I'm drawn to the words of that great opening batsman and Frank's fellow tourist to South Africa, Pelham Warner, who expressed sorrow at the loss of Frank Milligan and the fact that somewhere on the desolate veldt he sleeps. So as we near the conclusion of the film, we're back in Harold Park, Low Moor in Bradford, heading towards the Milligan Memorial. We learnt earlier that it was originally sited near to the Cemetery Road entrance. You can see that position detailed on this map of the park from the year 1915. The SD is an abbreviation for sundial, which sat atop the memorial. We're making our way to the area which is marked Bowling Green in 1915, but is now the present-day location for the memorial.
So this film has really only come about because one day I was in the park doing my usual circuit, and the footpath just tends to lead you past this area on the right, which is known as the Rose Garden. I knew of the Boer War Memorial, but this one particular day I thought I'll take a closer look. And as I got to the memorial and read the inscription, it was the wording on there that made me think this is something worth researching. One thing led to another, and before you knew it, I had enough information. I thought this man's had, although a short life, it's quite an interesting life. And I didn't really think that not many people would know that much about him, so I decided to make this film. And I'll show you the inscription now. This is the inscription that sort of teased me and made me want to find out more. I'll read it for you. To the memory of Lieutenant Frank W. Milligan of Royds Hall and a member of the Yorkshire County Cricket 11. He fell bravely defending the position assigned to him while serving under Colonel Plummer with the Rhodesian Frontier Force in the attempted relief of Mafeking. 31st of March 1900. The memorial was erected by public subscription in addition to the endowment of the Frank W. Milligan cots in the Bradford Children's Hospital. So, normally on a war memorial you just see a name and a date, and that's it. And behind every name On a war memorial, of course, there's a life, there's friends, there's family. They each have a story to tell. But it was this where it mentioned he fell bravely defending the position assigned to him, which made me want to know, well, what was that position? What were his orders that caused his death there? And that was the beginning of the film, basically. So from being a monument dedicated just to Frank Milligan, it was then adapted to the memory of those others who fell in the Boer War from Bradford. The monument was unveiled by the Right Honourable the Lord Hawke, 27th of May 1902, and the memorial was restored at the instigation of the late Mrs Mary Saxton of Wyke, the last headmistress at Bradford High School, who died in '87. Now, the Milligan Memorial has had quite a life in its own right, and maybe we should say a little bit about that as well. But you can see the hexagonal base. Now, this is a new base because the one at the original location, the steps were there for many years. They've clearly mounted the memorial on a new set of steps.
We previously heard that there was almost an instantaneous wish for some sort of memorial to Frank. This letter to the Yorkshire Post probably reflects those calls. With every other follower of Yorkshire cricket, and doubtless thousands outside the county, it is with deep regret that I read in your issue the absolute confirmation of the death of Mr. Frank Milligan. He died the death that every true Briton and good sportsman might desire, fighting bravely to relieve his fellow countrymen for Queen, flag and empire. Peace to his ashes. His pleasing presence, genial, gentlemanly manner and plucky play in the field endeared him to all who took an interest in cricket, and it will be a long before the lad from Low Moor is forgotten by true tykes. A letter to the Yorkshire Observer in 1936 remarked that there are a large number of people in Low Moor and Wyke that knew Frank Milligan who are indignant on account of the vandalism which has been done to the memorial erected to his honour in Harold Park. The writer tells us the angle of the sundial went missing and the bronze plaque was wrenched from its setting. The letter goes on to say that when one of the park dams was cleaned, the missing part of the sundial was found in the mud. Also, the bronze was found weeks later in a potting shed. A plea is made. May I appeal to the Parks Committee to repair the damage and make the memorial once again a treasure. Then in 1952, another person has cause to write to the newspaper, concerned at the memorial's decay. It is described as a disgusting shambles. The writer points out that the upright and the dial has disappeared. The inscription is almost illegible, and the copper plate, partly unscrewed, is a mass of verdigris. The writer hopes that the authorities into whose charge the public placed the memorial will show the respect that is due to a great Yorkshireman by restoring it in connection with its 50th anniversary. Was the sundial ever found after its disappearance in 1952, or was it replaced only to vanish again? With this photograph, which I believe was taken around 2014, the footprint of the dial can be clearly seen. I'd be very interested to learn when the memorial was moved to the Rose Garden, and also when the restoration works, funded by Mrs. Saxton, were completed. If you do know, please let me know in the comments. I think the bronze inscription plate could do with some protection, not only from any future attempts at vandalism, but also the weather. Rust has appeared and caused staining, possibly a perspex screen over the bronze inscription. Maybe something to preserve the original commemoration stone too, which is showing its age. Something in keeping and not too obtrusive. We now know how the public very quickly subscribed to remember Frank Milligan in Bradford. His sacrifice has also been honoured elsewhere. The parishioners of the Church of St Giles in Caldwell, Derbyshire, and members of Caldwell Cricket Club, for whom Frank was president, raised £36 in 1901. This enabled a pair of brass altar rails with an inscription and black polished marble steps with green Connemara risers to be installed in the church. Lieutenant Colonel Milligan and his wife funded a stained glass window to their son. It bears the image of St Hubert the Hunter, and at his feet the inscription, "To the glory of God and ever dear memory of Frank William Milligan, Lieutenant, Rhodesian Frontier Force, killed in action near Mafeking, 31st of March 1900. This window is dedicated by his father and mother. The Bishop of Southwell dedicated both memorials on Sunday the 29th of September 1901. On the 2nd of November 1905, a memorial service was held in Lupton Chapel at Eton College. It was for old Etonians who fell in South Africa during the Boer War or who died of disease or other causes, and whose names were recorded on a brass erected in the chapel. Frank is number 126 on the list of names, and his inscription reads, "Frank William Milligan, Lieutenant, Rhodesian Regiment, killed in action at Ramathlabama near Mafeking, 31st of March 1900. Yorkshire Cricket Club has a war memorial at Headingley Stadium in Leeds that bears the names of 5 Yorkshire cricketers who were killed in action or died of their wounds. Frank is at the top of the board with the inscription, Lieutenant F.W. Milligan, Rhodesia Frontier Force, killed Ramathlabama, South Africa, 31st of March 1900, aged 30. It's to their shame that after contacting the England Cricket Board and the MCC, I discovered that they don't honour their former players who were killed in the Boer War. Their remembrances only commence with World War I. Whilst Boer War memorials are not as numerous in this country as those dedicated to the fallen of World Wars I and II, surely those cricketers should be remembered publicly too. It's not too late to retrospectively honour men such as Frank Milligan. I like to think of him as he was summed up in this tribute from 1916. There was a joie de vivre about all Frank Milligan's cricket. He was always after runs when batting, always after wickets when bowling, and always striving for the seemingly impossible in the field. Though he was a cricketer from the late Victorian era, Frank Milligan certainly won't look out of place in the current England side. With their exciting approach to playing the game, which has won them so many plaudits, it would have been the perfect fit. Although he wasn't around for long, I hope Frank enjoyed his 30 years of life and that he was happy and satisfied for the most of it. There've been no books or documentaries about Frank Milligan, so this film is a first. I would love to hear from you in the comments if you were able to add anything to the story, or just let me know what you thought. I do read and acknowledge every comment that I receive. If you've liked the film, please share it with your friends, family or colleagues who you think may also be interested in watching it.
The memorial now acts as a more general cenotaph, and the Friends of Harrow Park can hold Remembrance Day services here. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the film. It's taken some putting together, I can tell you. I certainly enjoyed doing the research and putting everything together It's probably been taking me the longest out of all the videos that I've done. I feel it was well worth telling. Often with war memorials, they're more poignant for the people who have living memories of the people who died. Obviously, when you go back to the Boer War and beyond, those conflicts are more or less forgotten. We do tend in our age to concentrate on World War I, World War II and wars and conflicts that have taken place since the end of the Second World War. No doubt as we go into the century, as we get to the end of the century, World War I, World War II sacrifices will be almost, we'll have turned the page and we'll be concentrating on people who've died in conflicts in more recent times. That's the way of the world, that's time for you. But I just thought I'd bring the life of Frank Milligan and his sacrifice, just one man, back to the forefront of people's minds. And if you live in Low Moor, maybe you can come and see the memorial in the Rose Garden for yourself. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed the film, and then thank you very much for watching, especially if you've watched it all the way through, because it's been quite a marathon, hasn't it? And I hope to see you again wherever the next trip takes us. Until then, Dodger and out.